Hope you're doing well today. It is Tuesday, noon Eastern time, and we are here today to have another discussion about trauma and how it's impacted us. Today, I'm going to talk about something I haven't talked about in a while, although I have discussed this topic before, but it tends to come out differently the more that I continue my journey. So we'll see if that's true today and how it shows up for you guys. But I'm going to talk today about depression, and I particularly want to focus on the way that I've organized it is that we'll be talking about 4 facts about depression. So these are facts as I see them based on my own personal journey to heal a tremendous amount of the emotions that are behind depression in my own personal life, and also in working with other clients to do that as well. And so my hope is that I can help to make a little bit more sense of depression for people that are on this journey and finding themselves to be paralyzed by it a lot of the time. Because I'll be honest, most of the traditional stuff out there about depression is quite nebulous. It doesn't give us a lot of great information about depression in general. While it is one of the most common feelings, that and anxiety, probably between the two of them, the most common feelings, it is really misunderstood, or if it's not misunderstood, it's just sort of not really defined at all in a lot of ways. It seems to me it's either misdefined or it's not defined, and that's sort of where we are with depression in general. And in addition to that, because there is such a strong dislike for depression in general, and I mean by us as individuals when we have it, it becomes very hard to spot. And then it becomes really hard to do anything about because we don't really know that it's there. Not entirely. I mean, I would venture to say that almost everybody in the world today has some depressive feelings in their system that they're trying to work around on a daily basis. But again, they may not even know it, right? So I want to share my understanding of depression with you. My hope with this is that it will help you become more aware and be able to spot it for yourself in your own life. And as I go through these facts, you'll also get a better understanding about why that is so important that we do this. Because I'll be honest, like our freedom and especially our emotional freedom is really riding on us being able to work with depression in a different way than we have in the past. So I really want to stress the importance of this because it really isn't well defined in sort of mainstream medical or mental health kind of avenues, generally speaking. I want to say hi to Shabnam. Glad you are joining. So I said I was going to talk about 4 facts. So you may be like, well, what are these 4 facts? So I'm going to give you some facts. And of course, these are facts based on my understanding of depression after years and years and years of working with it and also working with my clients who have it. Fact number 1, depression is not the lack of emotion or numbness or what's sometimes referred to as the void, okay? That is actually not what depression is, okay? So what depression is it's actually an emotional flashback. Now, it's an extremely convincing flashback, which means that it's very hard for us to spot that it is in fact not about right now. The stories that it tells are very convincing. The emotions it's giving to us in our body are very convincing, right? So, but it is in fact most of the time a flashback. The feelings that depression tends to kind of have associated with it are going to be feelings like hopelessness, helplessness, powerlessness. Now, with those feelings, I tend to group them into an emotion. So the way that I work is I have 5 basic traumatic emotions, and then there's a lot of feelings associated with each one of those emotions. So the emotion I usually talk about when it comes to depression is something called futility. Now, it can also be very, very synonymous with the feelings that I've just described. But generally, when I speak about futility on these live streams or in my blogs, I'm referring to the baseline emotion, the foundational emotion associated with depression. So I want to start with that because a lot of people don't know what it is, right? They don't know what depression actually is. So it's very hard to then address it in any way, shape, or form. And I think there's been a lot of misperceptions out there that depression is actually a lack of emotion. And I am here to tell you that's not the case. Now, the emotion that it isn't is sadness. So that's another thing that can sometimes happen out there in the world of the information about depression is people can believe that depression is synonymous with sadness. I do not see it that way, but as I continue to talk about depression, I'll show you the relationship. Sadness, again, is a feeling in the work that the way that I've structured my work around emotions. Sadness is a feeling. The emotion I refer to as grief, and grief and futility are highly connected to one another, but they're not the same. So you will feel sad when you're futile. Absolutely, you will. But generally, that's another emotion, and I'll talk about the relationship between futility and that sadness or grief in just a minute as well. As I said a minute ago, this depression or futility as its baseline emotion is coming from the past. It is coming from childhood because in childhood, we were at our most powerless. We were at our most helpless. And generally speaking, if we wanted to make change happen, that was the time of our life when it was the most unlikely to happen at any time in our lives. Okay, so I really want to stress that most of the time, again, that we're feeling this heavy depression or futility, it is a flashback feeling. Now, those flashback feelings can be triggered and often are triggered by something very specific. Learning what those triggers are, I can tell you, is like life-saving. To know what it is that's going to trigger a depressive episode in us, that's amazing because then we can build awareness around what's going to happen there. And I can tell you there's a big difference when you're hit with a bout of futility that you don't know is coming versus getting hit with a bout of futility that you do know is coming. There's such a difference between those two things and how we can cope with it. So knowing what your triggers are for depression, very, very helpful. I'm going to go through a few examples of what kinds of things trigger depression and futility that I've seen over the years of doing this work. Number one, illness. Being sick really brings on a very strong, helpless feeling, right? So being sick is a big one. For a lot of us who are dealing with chronic illness and chronic pain, this can mean that we're constantly having futility and depression triggered by the state of our bodies. And so that is a massive trigger that happens. And I'm going to talk more about what we can do with this as we continue this discussion. Fact 4, we'll discuss a little bit about how we can address this, right? So another big trigger for futility is the failure to make something happen. Okay. So maybe you've been driving towards something. Maybe your controller has been trying to push through the futility and get something done. That thing doesn't happen. Can really move us into a pretty big bout of futility and depression. Another trigger for this might be very familiar relationship patterns and cycles. Okay. So if you find that every time you try to build a relationship with another person, it never fails. It turns into a really bad traumatic pattern, or there's a lot of dysfunction in the relationship. And a lot of times you don't even see these things right away, right? They're things that show up later. Those will also push us into a significant depressive episode. Now, when we're in recovery work, there are other ways in which we might get triggered or might have futility triggered. And one of the biggest ways is as we try to step into doing something new and exciting, whether that be with recovery or maybe, taking a step in our lives, in our businesses, or in our parenting, or just in general, trying to make our lives better. Sometimes futility will pop up then for us because it's sort of like saying, don't bother because we tried this a million times. It's not going to work, right? So it can be triggered even when there's something really positive, when we're standing up for ourselves, setting boundaries. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're doing something like that, if you can have awareness that the futility is likely to come for a visit because of that thing you're doing, it changes a lot about how we manage that. And it gives us a lot more power, really, to manage it and to work with it instead of just getting sort of walloped upside the head with it, which is often what has happened to us when it comes to depressive episodes. So that's fact number one. So it is a flashback, and it is often triggered by something happening in your life, or that you are trying to do. So that's fact number one. Fact number two about depression is that it's a defense, okay? This one's hard to hear, and I'll be honest, you may find yourself dissociating when I start talking about this one and also fact three. But depression is a defense, which means that depression is not the starting place. It often isn't the first thing to get triggered in our system. So all of those examples I mentioned before where I said these things trigger depression, they actually trigger something first, okay? And I'll be honest, at the most basic and foundational level, the thing that gets triggered first is grief, okay? And actually in this journey, I like to look at emotions as sort of on this sort of layered scale. Grief is at the very baseline foundational level. Like our goal is always to get to grief. Now, we're going to cycle through all these emotions and come back around to grief many, many times in the course of our recovery. But that end point, if you want to put it that way, because controllers love to talk about endpoints, is grief. Like that's really where we're heading. But again, it's a cycle, so we're going to go through that many times. But so grief is often the thing that's triggered because what's happening to us in our daily life is bringing up and reminding us of our losses and the fact that we have been unable to fix them in our adult life. Now, our job is actually not to fix our losses. Our job is to feel our losses by feeling the grief. But it does, when something goes wrong, when a pattern is repeated, the first thing that often shows up is the grief. But the second thing that shows up is a defense against the grief. And I'll be honest, grief is one of the most, it is the most defended emotion in our system. And it's not just defended by depression. So the other thing that can often show up when we're trying to avoid feeling grief is anger. And many times when we're depressed, we'll kind of move in and out of this futility and into anger and then back into futility. And that's actually these two defenders fighting with each other to block that grief. So we may feel really angry and then all of a sudden we can't get off the couch. And this is sort of going back and forth between these two parts. And it leads to a lot of confusion. Again, depression is really hard to understand and we haven't really defined it very well. So this is one of those things. It's like, how, when I'm that depressed and I can't get off the couch, am I also feeling a ton of anger? It's because depression is a defense, anger is a defense, and they're fighting in the moment over which one is going to be expressing in your system at a time. Okay. While we do want to work with those, eventually our goal is to reach that grief and express those losses that are really associated with the grief, the losses from childhood. So that's really where we want to land, but we're not going to get there right away. So we have to do other things first. So that is fact number 2. Depression is a defense. Okay. Fact number 3, also one that you might feel a bit of dissociation about when I mention it, because I'm going to call out the controller now. The controller is in charge of dissociation in our system. So depression is defended against by the controller. Okay. So we got controller at the top with their dissociation and numbness. Then we had the futility and the anger right underneath that. Then we have shame, fear, and we have grief. Now, fear has a whole lot of layers. I won't get into that today because that's not why we're here. But know that when you feel that it feels like there may be some depression there, but you can't really pinpoint it, but you also feel super, super numb, that is your controller trying to block the futility and depression. That is not the depression itself. Depression is not numb. Sometimes it gets numbness and sort of this void idea get attributed to depression. but that's actually a secondary thing going on in our system. As you may have guessed, this is all quite complicated, but the numbness is the controller's attempts to block that depression. Okay. And controllers on a societal level run from depression. They are terrified of depression. So they attempt to keep us moving, and like literally, as long as we're moving, if we don't sit down, right, we won't feel the futility. That's generally the controller's mindset about it. The problem is, in general, this numbing of the depression, this running from the depression doesn't really do us any favors because it's still sitting there, but it's less obvious because the numbness is blocking our awareness of it. And again, this is on purpose. Controller does not want to address this futility, this depression, which usually comes from another part I refer to as the karmic head. So controller's trying to block this, right? So what do we have to do then? What do we have to do with that? We have to look a little bit harder. When we are feeling a lot of numbness, and we also can't really get much done, okay? That usually means that we've got futility under the surface and a controller numbing that futility out. So we have to kind of look for clues in our behavior that help us notice that the futility is actually there. And I'll give you some examples of clues that I know that I'm in futility, but also numb, so I can't really sense it or feel it. The biggest one is going to be scrolling social media incessantly. I mean, that actually is my number one thing because I can't totally avoid social media because here I am, right? I work on social media. So what often will happen is I'll sit down at my computer to do some work, and the next thing I know, a half hour has gone by, and I have done nothing but scroll, right? Just scroll. Can't get anything done. That is a sign that underneath the surface, I've got some futility that is in fact brewing. Again, the controller's blocking it, so it's not so easy to see. So the way we find it is we look at our behaviors and we use those as kind of flags or signs that something is there under the surface. And Shabnam is saying several hours for me. Yes, I can do that too, right? I'll tell you what, I feel like the addition of videos has made this so much worse for me. I used to avoid the reels, and now I watch the reels and I get caught up in the reels. Yeah. So this is a sign that we're feeling futile, but the controller is kind of blocking that feeling. Look, if the feeling of depression was loud and clear without any numbness at all, you would know it immediately. You'd also feel like it would be hard to do anything, which is exactly what the controller doesn't want. But we do need to see it because fact 4 is going to be about what we can do about it. And yes, we can do something about depression. We don't just have to sit in it until it decides to go away. We don't have to be at its mercy. And we also don't have to run from it the way that the controller does, which is sort of like being at its mercy as well. We can address depression through expression. And yes, that rhymes, and I just realized it. We can do emotional journaling here to address the depression, okay? When I discovered that I could write from depression, I would say there were 2 times in my life when so much changed for me. One was when I noticed depression was a flashback. That was massive. The other one was when I realized that I can write from it and I can make the feeling less. Now, again, I'm not saying that I can just magically write from it for 5 minutes and all my depression has vanished. This is a constant, repetitive process. But when I discovered that I could sit down and write from that depression, which really is writing from the emotion of futility, right? Again, like I mentioned at the beginning, there's an emotion that is specific to depression. I refer to it as futility. When I realized I could write from that, it changed so much. Before that, it was just sitting on the couch, waiting to get my energy back, but understanding the writing changed everything. Now, because the controller may also be numbing it out a little bit. It can be hard to work with because you may or may not even know the futility is there. And this is where I like to talk about this idea of kind of, I will refer to them as like sort of these preventative writings. And they're not really preventative because you definitely are already in that feeling, like it's there, you're in it. But even with the numbness in place, you can still write from it. And oftentimes as we write from it, it draws that depression up and out. And some people will say, I don't want to write from it. It makes it worse. Initially, it does, but then it releases, right? This is why the controller tries to avoid it. So what do we write from? Now, I personally have 3 of my all-time favorite writing prompts that I use when I am scrolling forever. I write from 3 prompts, and usually I'll just pick the one that really resonates with me the most in the moment. And your journey will be to figure out which prompts are best for you, okay? But the first one is, what's the point? My favorite, all-time favorite writing prompt right there. Like, that's it. That's my go-to prompt a lot of the time. What's the point? And usually that continues with, none of this is going to change anything. It's always going to be the same. It's not going to make any difference. Why are we bothering with this writing? It isn't going to help us. So why are we bothering with doing anything at all? Okay, this is the epitome of depression. So I use what's the point a lot. I write from it almost every single day. And if I skip a day, it's probably because my controller got a hold of me. And that's the reason I skipped a day. I can tell you, I am a very, very repetitive writer of what's the point, and it has made a huge difference in my life. The other 2 prompts I will use is nothing is going to change, which I'll be honest, sometimes these prompts will sort of work together in the same writing, right? Nothing is going to change. I'm not going to change anything, right? The other one I use is, it's not going to make a difference. Like, what you're doing is not going to change anything. Now, remember, these are parts who are experience based. They are really focused on, not like giving up. Like, why waste your time? Nothing is going to work. They're focused on their experiences of having always been thwarted when they attempted to get what they wanted. And as children, we attempted to get what we wanted a lot. We didn't just give up. That may be how our memory is working about it, but I guarantee you, there were a lot of attempts to, improve the situation and take your life back. None of it did work because in these kind of environments, it's not going to. You were a child. You didn't have the power. But this stuff is still there, still informing you, still saying don't bother, right? It's there. And that's what we have to write to move out. So that is my 4 facts for you today. I see that Elke is here and she's saying, LOL, try an hour or 2, or she's referring to scrolling social media. Didn't realize its futility. My mom would always call my sedentary moments lazy. And I will tell you, without a doubt, most of the time in our society, futility or people who struggle with depression in general, it is labeled lazy. Actually, just thinking about that this morning, even before I picked this topic, how oftentimes the label for a general feeling of powerlessness becomes lazy. And what we consider to be an acceptable behavior is to sit in that controller and kind of run from that feeling that it's pointless until we exhaust ourselves. And that is what society considers acceptable. Society is very controller-based. Most of our systems were created by what I call the macro controller, which is lots of controllers coming together, creating our systems. So society is just so focused on the controller behavior being the best or the acceptable norm, right? While the sort of karma kid futility or even the mean kid's anger, those things are considered to be not acceptable, which is why we developed the system that we did in the first place, right? Like that we created. The reason our controller is often in charge is because we learned very young that that was the only acceptable behavior. So that gives the controller a lot of power. It's only when we start to find our own compassion for ourselves and all of our emotions that we can move this emotion through, process it so that we can kind of come more into the ground itself. Shabnam is saying, are we hoping for the writing to then evolve into a more hopeful outlook, i.e. the point is? Not necessarily. And I mean, it's an excellent question. Absolutely. Elka's saying, good question. It is a good question. But really the goal in the writing is to write from the perspective of the parts, because that's what helps to release the ungroundedness of what that perspective is, so that we can ground more into the body. I'll be honest, we don't have to write from the point is ever, because as we release what's the point, that becomes more of a natural state that we take on. Now, it's okay to write from the point is. Sometimes I even say if we're really truly enmeshed in the futility, it can help to even write from things like what if, like I like to say what if questions, like what if there is a point? What if we could make a change? What if something could change? Just kind of to take the edge off of the futility and make it more like a conversation with the part instead of feeling totally enmeshed by the futility. So there is a benefit to that, but it isn't necessarily the goal. We don't have to do it if we're not feeling totally enmeshed, but it can be something we do to give us a little bit of space from that feeling. So again, can do it, don't have to do it. The real feeling that there is a point is innately in you. Like it's a part of who you are. Your grounded adult self knows there's a point. So you don't have to write from it, but you certainly, hey, I guess that's fine. Like that, to me, I usually don't focus my attention on writing from the adult self because the adult self is just there. It's just there. And our goal is to open up that channel to that adult self through the expression of trauma, so that the trauma, I sometimes think of trauma as like the static between us and our intuition, or us and like our real wisdom. As we move the trauma out, that channel becomes so much clearer so that we can hear it so much better. But we can always express from our intuition or our adult self. There's nothing wrong with doing it. It's just that's not where we move the trauma out. Like that's what I do with the writing, the emotional expression. So yeah, so great question. So thank you all so much for being here today. I know this isn't a super exciting topic that everybody wants to talk about, but it certainly is an extremely important topic. As a matter of fact, for me, understanding depression and futility and being able to work with that instead of just sort of letting it take over my life has been absolutely critical to my journey of healing and to my ability to then be able to, in fact, do things that are different from what I may have chosen to do before. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday, noon Eastern, with another topic for us to discuss around trauma. So thank you all so much for being here, and I will talk to you very soon.